Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a mathematician, but with a bunch of frostbitten maniacs who thought the North Atlantic was a casual commute, the Vikings. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing every Viking learned about sailing wasn't courage, navigation, or how to swing an axe. It was cold. A specific kind of cold. The kind that seeps into your bones, makes your teeth ache, and convinces you that maybe raiding monasteries in the Mediterranean would have been a better career choice. The North Sea doesn't care about your dreams, your courage, or your fancy Viking tattoos. It's a grey, freezing graveyard with waves shaped like bad decisions. And yet, for reasons known only to the gods and pure stubbornness, the Vikings sailed right into it. Viking longships were engineering marvels. Fast, sleek, and about as cosy as a coffin with oars. They had no cabins, no insulation, and certainly no below deck. You stood, you froze, and you prayed your beard didn't snap off in the wind. It was basically camping. If camping involved hypothermia, frostbite, and the occasional sea monster, every wave hit like a personal insult. The wind wasn't just cold, it was a living entity that hated you specifically. Helmets frosted over in minutes, beards turned to stalactites, and eyebrows froze into the same expression of eternal regret. The ocean spray didn't splash, it stabbed. And lighting a fire? Not an option. One spark on a tar-sealed ship and congratulations. You're now the world's first Viking flambé. So they rode without warmth, without light, and without the faintest idea why they thought this was a good lifestyle choice. The men wrapped themselves in heavy wool cloaks, the medieval equivalent of damp bath towels, and pretended it helped. Wool smelled terrible when wet, which it always was, but at least it hid the tears. They lined the deck with straw to insulate it, though insulation means nothing when your boat is basically a floating fridge. Sleeping was its own form of torture. The deck doubled as a bed, pillow, and personal ice sheet. You curled up beside 20 other frozen men, all of whom smelled like fear and fish, and hoped no one rolled over and stole your only dry sock. There were moments when the sea calmed. Glassy, still, silent. That's when the real horror set in. You'd look around and realise you couldn't feel your fingers, your toes, or your will to live. And yet, the Vikings kept sailing. Not because they were brave, not because they were fearless, but because somewhere deep down they knew one eternal truth. Freezing to death at sea was still more fun than farming turnips in Norway. At the end of a long day of rowing through freezing hell, you might imagine the Vikings retreating to their cosy cabins, lighting a small fire, and snuggling into warm furs. You'd be wrong. There were no cabins, no fires, no snuggling. Unless you count collapsing next to a guy named Harold who hadn't bathed since last spring. The Viking longship was a marvel of simplicity, a giant wooden freezer disguised as transportation. The deck was open, the wind was relentless, and everything, including you, was damp. The North Sea didn't care if you were tired. It wanted you tired and slightly dead. Sleeping arrangements were generous, in the same way that a coffin is spacious. Each man had roughly 1/2 metre of deck space, just enough to lie flat if you didn't mind a shield boss in your spine. There were no mattresses, no blankets, just straw scattered across the planks to soak up seawater and human despair. By morning, it froze into a crunchy layer of Viking regret. Their beds were their cloaks. Thick wool, always wet, always smelling faintly of goat and defeat. Some used sheepskins or furs, but those froze solid too, turning every nap into an archaeological experiment in discomfort. You didn't lie down to rest. You negotiated with frostbite. The trick to staying alive was layering. Vikings wrapped themselves like human onions. Wool tunics, cloaks, and sometimes an extra pelt if they'd raided someone wealthier and warmer. But no matter how many layers they wore, the cold always found a way in. like an uninvited guest who brought pneumonia to dinner. To make things worse, sleeping near the edge of the ship meant catching the occasional splash of salt water right to the face. Sleeping in the middle meant being trampled by the morning rowing shift. There was no good spot, only slightly less horrible options. And yet, they somehow slept. Not comfortably, not warmly, but out of sheer exhaustion. Their bodies shut down before their brains could remember they were dying of cold. Because on a Viking longship, sleeping well didn't mean waking up refreshed. It just meant waking up at all. When your entire ship is made of wood, tar, and Viking ego, you tend to develop a healthy respect for fire. One misplaced spark and congratulations. You've invented the world's first floating bonfire. So instead of lighting campfires on deck like normal lunatics, Vikings used something more subtle, smouldering embers. Each crew carried what they called the sleeping fire, a small metal or clay container filled with slow-burning coals, buried in ash. It didn't flame, it just glowed quietly, like the last shred of hope on a winter morning. The embers were tucked away under a clay pot, or inside an iron brazier, the Viking equivalent of central heating, if central heating came with a 50% chance of burning your ship down. Losing those embers was a serious offence. It meant no fire at camp, no cooked food, and no light to keep away whatever creature was making that sound in the dark. A good crewman could keep coals alive for days, blowing gently into the ash when the glow started to fade. You weren't just rowing a ship, you were babysitting a fire. At night, men would gather around the brazier, palms out, eyes half shut, pretending it was warm. The truth? It wasn't. The thing gave off less heat than a dying candle, but it was symbolic, a reminder that somewhere in this frozen purgatory, fire still existed. The embers weren't for cooking. Nobody risked that. Meals were eaten cold or smoked long before departure. The brazier's job was purely psychological, a flicker of civilization in a world made entirely of wet wood and despair. Occasionally, the brazier would tip over in rough seas, filling the air with sparks. This was followed by several minutes of screaming, frantic stomping, and heartfelt prayers to every god in the Norse pantheon. Miraculously, most of them lived, which only reinforced the Viking belief that Odin personally protected idiots. So no, they didn't heat their ships with roaring fires or clever engineering. They kept a tiny ember alive, the most fragile, inconvenient warmth imaginable. And somehow, it was enough. Because that's what Vikings did best. Take something small, dangerous, and barely working, and call it innovation. Vikings called it the sleeping fire, a poetic name for something that mostly refused to cooperate. It wasn't a flame but a smoulder, a slow, stubborn glow hidden under layers of ash. A tiny ember, small enough to cradle in your hands and important enough to fight over. It was fire in hibernation, and like every Viking on that ship, it was one bad gust away from giving up completely. The ember box was treated like a holy relic. Losing it meant humiliation, starvation, and another long night pretending to enjoy frozen fish. Crews guarded it the way modern people guard phone batteries. Obsessive, panicked, and with a deep sense of existential dependence. If the fire died, morale sank with it, because when your gods live in the sky and your feet live in ice water, that little glow feels like the only proof you're still alive. Each morning, someone was assigned to check the ember box. The unlucky soul would crouch over it, blow gently, and hope the coals still breathed. If they didn't, congratulations. You just became the least popular man on the ship. There were no redos. You'd have to make new fire from scratch, using flint, steel, and what little will to live remained. Doing that with frozen fingers and a moving deck was roughly as easy as building IKEA furniture in a hurricane. When the ship finally reached land, the sleeping fire was awakened again, stirred, fed, and coaxed into life. The crew gathered around like it was a returning god. They'd roast meat, dry clothes, and sit in blissful silence, all pretending they hadn't spent the last week arguing with a piece of metal and ash. Some sagas describe the Ember Keeper as a sacred role, others as a punishment. Either way, it was stressful. You weren't just carrying warmth, you were carrying everyone's sanity in a jar. Drop it, and you'd wish the sea had taken you first. So no. The Vikings didn't have fireplaces or heating systems. They had one half-dead ember rattling in a clay box, and the faith of men too cold to question why. The fire slept, but it dreamed of better owners. When it came to clothing, Vikings had one rule. If it keeps you alive, it's fashion. Forget elegance. This was survival couture. The North Sea didn't care if you looked heroic. It cared whether your internal organs froze before breakfast. Every Viking outfit started with wool, thick, itchy, and perpetually damp. Wool tunics, wool trousers, wool socks, and wool cloaks. They lived inside a mobile sheep. It trapped air for warmth, absorbed water like a sponge, and smelled like a wet farm animal, because it was one. Vikings didn't mind. The smell kept both frostbite and personal space at bay. Over that came animal hides, deer, bear, seal, reindeer, basically anything that had once moved faster than a Viking with a club. The hides were heavy and stiff, but they blocked the wind. Furs lined cloaks and hoods, forming what scholars now call the Viking sauna aesthetic. It was functional layering centuries before the North Face figured it out. The goal was simple. Create as many barriers between your skin and the apocalypse as possible. Some warriors even wore multiple tunics, not for style, but because they hadn't discovered laundry yet. Boots were a whole other story. Viking footwear was more concept than comfort. Leather bound with cords, stuffed with dry grass or moss for insulation. It worked surprisingly well, until the grass froze, turning every step into a game of how much pain can you hide while pretending to be fearless? Colours. Muted. Brown, grey, maybe a little red if you'd just raided someone with taste. Dyes were expensive and unnecessary. Nobody cared about fashion critique when your eyebrows were frozen together. Jewellery, though. That was their one indulgence. Rings, brooches, armbands, all gleaming under frost. If you were freezing to death, you might as well look rich doing it. And while the sagas paint them as rugged gods of war, most Vikings probably looked like sleep-deprived lumberjacks wrapped in roadkill. Their outfits dripped seawater, sweat, and animal fat. And somehow that still wasn't the worst smell on the ship. But their layered madness worked. The wind could cut, the sea could bite, and the gods could mock. But the Vikings stayed alive. Uncomfortable, yes. Unwashed, certainly. But alive, which, in the North Sea, was about as fashionable as it got. If there was one body part the Vikings truly feared losing to the cold, it was their feet. Fingers were optional. You could still swing a sword with a few missing. But toes, that was serious. No one wants to raid Paris with feet that snap like stale breadsticks. The human foot wasn't designed for the North Sea. It was designed for walking on dirt, not standing in frozen puddles on a wooden deck, while your commander shouts poetry about honour. Viking ships were constantly soaked, sea spray, melting ice, and the tears of men who realised this was their job. The result? Frostbite as a lifestyle. To fight it, they invented Viking socks. Not wool, not cotton, but grass. Dried sedge or moss, packed inside their shoes like organic insulation. You'd stuff your boots full, squish your feet in, and hope it stayed dry for more than 10 minutes. It rarely did, but at least it gave the illusion that you were doing something productive while freezing to death. The shoes themselves were simple leather wraps, more foot suggestion than footwear. You tied them tight, said a prayer, and tried not to think about the fact that you were basically walking barefoot on ice. Archaeologists have found Viking boots that look more like experimental origami than fashion. They worked, sort of, if by worked you mean delayed frostbite until lunchtime. Some men smeared animal fat or tallow on their feet before putting on socks. The logic was sound. Grease repels moisture. The side effect was that the ship now smelled like a combination of seal carcass and despair. Even at camp there was no relief. You couldn't dry your boots by the fire. They'd shrink, warp, or burst into flames. So you just kept wearing them, day and night, until your toes went numb enough to stop complaining. And yet, they marched, they rode, they conquered. Because Vikings didn't let pain stop them. They simply rebranded it as endurance. So yes, they froze, limped, and occasionally lost a toe or two. But they also crossed oceans with nothing but grass in their boots, which, in fairness, is still better insulation than whatever's inside your motivational gym shoes. At first glance, a Viking longship looks sleek, elegant, and powerful, the very image of naval supremacy. Then you realise it's also basically a wooden popsicle stick with oars. It had beauty, yes, but comfort? Absolutely not. Calling it home was like calling a coffin a compact apartment. Still, the longship was a masterpiece of practical design. Every curve, every plank, every tar-sealed seam served one purpose: not sinking. And in the North Sea, that alone was a kind of luxury. But warmth? That was extra. To keep out the wind, shipbuilders overlapped planks in what's called clinker construction, sealing every gap with tar and animal fat. It worked surprisingly well, until the sea reminded you that tar only stops water, not cold. The ocean didn't need to leak inside. It just reached through the wood and strangled your soul. To make things cozier, the Vikings hung their shields along the ship's sides. The sagas tell us this was for defence, but let's be honest, half the time it was to block wind from freezing their eyeballs. Those circular shields turned the ship into a kind of mobile windbreak, a floating burrito of misery wrapped in wood and frost. Some crews even stuffed moss and straw between planks or under their sleeping spots to create insulation. It helped, briefly. Then it got wet, froze solid, and became part of the floor. If you could pry it off in spring, congratulations. You'd invented early Scandinavian flooring. When storms hit, the ship flexed and groaned like a living thing. Every board expanding, every seam threatening mutiny. Men huddled in the hull, shivering and praying the engineering miracle beneath them didn't suddenly remember it was made entirely of trees. But for all its flaws, the longship was a kind of blanket, a thin, creaking shield between man and oblivion. It didn't keep you warm, but it gave you something to cling to while pretending not to die. Because for Vikings, that was enough. You didn't need comfort, only construction. You didn't need heat, only hope. And if your ship didn't burn, sink, or split in half, well, that counted as a warm night. At some point, probably halfway through their third frostbite, the Vikings decided they deserved shelter. Not real shelter, mind you, not walls, roofs, or anything luxurious like that. Just a piece of canvas stretched over their heads so they could pretend the sky wasn't trying to kill them. They called it a ship tent, and it was about as effective as holding a napkin over a bonfire. Made from coarse wool or sailcloth, it draped across the longship's centre, anchored by oars, shields, and pure delusion. It didn't stop the cold. It didn't stop the rain. What it did stop was hope, and for morale, that counted. Under this makeshift tent, 20 to 30 men huddled together, packed tighter than salted fish. They lay shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in wet cloaks, pretending to sleep while slowly marinating in each other's breath. The air inside the tent was thick with moisture, sweat, and regret. If you survived the night, it wasn't from warmth, it was from mutual body heat and a shared refusal to admit defeat. Sometimes condensation would build up on the inside of the tent until it started raining from within. The Vikings called that weather. The modern term would be a cry for help. The real purpose of the ship tent wasn't warmth, though. It was illusion. When you're sleeping on an open deck with ice forming in your beard, even the faint shadow of a ceiling feels like civilization. It created a tiny psychological distance between outdoors and utter despair. Every now and then, a gust of wind would tear the canvas loose, flapping like the sails of a ghost ship. Nobody moved to fix it. They just sighed, accepted their fate, and added, losing the tent again, to the list of life's many insults. But for all its flaws, that sagging piece of fabric gave the illusion of a home, a fragile barrier between Vikings and the endless freezing void. Because that's how Vikings survived. Not through comfort, not through luxury, but through the sheer stubborn power of pretending things were fine when absolutely nothing was fine. And somehow, it worked. When you think of Viking feasts, you probably imagine roaring halls, roasted boars, and overflowing mead horns. But on a longship, forget that. Dinner on the open sea was basically punishment with calories. The menu never changed, cold, dry, and questionable. Cooking on deck was forbidden. Fire and wooden ships didn't mix well, unless you liked your meals served with screaming. So every Viking voyage began with weeks of pre-cooked misery. Smoked fish, salted meat, and hard bread tough enough to qualify as armour. If you could chew it without breaking a tooth, you were already halfway to Valhalla. Breakfast was dried herring, washed down with a gulp of seawater by accident. Lunch was more dried herring. Dinner? If you guessed dried herring, congratulations. You could survive the North Sea. Fresh meat was a luxury reserved for when someone's hunting luck outperformed their frostbite. Otherwise, you gnawed on your supplies and dreamed about fire. Vikings stored food in barrels sealed with tar, which meant everything tasted faintly of ship. Butter, cheese, grain, all lovingly infused with that signature, seaworthy flavour. And when mould appeared, which it always did, they just scraped it off and pretended it was seasoning. To keep their strength, they ate fat, lots of it. Whale blubber, pork grease, even melted animal fat smeared on bread like medieval margarine. It kept you warm and disgusted in equal measure. Some sagas mention sea porridge, a charming blend of oats, water, and regret. It was thick, tasteless, and could probably patch a hole in the hull if needed. Water wasn't safe to drink. It went rancid in storage, so they relied on ale or mead, weak enough not to kill you, but strong enough to make you briefly forget you were sitting in a floating freezer. Hydration by mild intoxication, the Viking way, and through all this they didn't complain. Not out loud, anyway. Food was fuel, not fun. You ate because you had to row another 100 miles through sleet, not because you enjoyed the subtle notes of salted despair. So yes, they survived without warmth, without comfort, and without taste buds. Because when you're a Viking, a full stomach counts as luxury, even if everything you eat tastes like shipwreck. If warmth couldn't come from fire, the Vikings found the next best thing, mead. Not because it actually worked, but because it made them care a lot less that it didn't. Mead was the Viking solution to almost every problem. Cold, boredom, fear, existential dread, the sound of 20 men snoring in unison. You name it, they drank about it. Made from honey, water, and wild yeast, it was sweet, strong, and deceptively cheerful, like drinking liquid courage brewed by someone with a head injury. On land, it was sacred. In the sagas, warriors toasted the gods with it before battle, claiming Odin himself drank the same stuff in Valhalla. At sea, it was more functional. You didn't raise a horn to honour Thor. You drank directly from the barrel to forget that your boots had frozen to your feet. Mead was stored in wooden casks, carefully sealed with tar and optimism. Over time, it picked up a distinct flavour, which as historians speak for, tasted like the inside of a Viking. It wasn't about taste anyway. It was about pretending that the warmth in your chest wasn't just your body giving up. There's a popular myth that alcohol warms you up. The Vikings believed it completely. In truth, it just widened your blood vessels, tricking you into thinking you weren't freezing. It's the same kind of warming that happens right before frostbite. But try telling that to a crew of half-frozen berserkers with mugs in hand. They didn't care. Science hadn't been invented yet. A few cups in, morale rose. Men sang louder, laughed harder, and suddenly the blizzard didn't seem so bad. They'd shout about glory, honour, and occasionally fall overboard. If the sea gods were merciful, they floated. If not, well, At least they died warm inside. By morning, the hangovers were heroic. Salt wind, pounding heads, dry mouths, the Viking trinity of regret. And yet, the moment the next barrel opened, they forgot all about it. Because when the world is frozen and the gods are silent, a cup of mead isn't just a drink. It's a tiny rebellion against the cold. Warmth may be an illusion, but it's one the Vikings happily drank to. When all else failed, when the fire was gone, the mead was empty and the cold had crawled into their souls, the Vikings turned to the oldest heat source known to humankind, each other. Yes, that's right. Viking survival strategy number 4 was the ancient Scandinavian art of, please don't die next to me, I need your body heat. On longships, personal space didn't exist. It was everyone's warmth, or everyone's funeral. At night, the crew lay shoulder to shoulder beneath their damp wool cloaks, forming one large collective disappointment. The sagas call this ship brothers. Archaeologists call it necessary. Modern people would probably call it trauma bonding. Either way, it worked. Each man was both heater and heated. If one rolled over, the others froze. If someone got up to pee, 10 curses followed him. There was no privacy, just a tangle of limbs, fur, and existential crisis. By dawn, you couldn't tell where one Viking ended and another began, physically or emotionally. To outsiders, it might sound strange. To Vikings, it was Tuesday. Warmth was warmth, dignity be damned. They weren't cuddling for affection. They were cuddling for thermodynamics. The only thing more awkward than the situation was explaining it afterward. Even their clothing worked in pairs. One man's cloak draped over both bodies, trapping air like an early medieval sleeping bag. The smell was profound, a mix of sweat, salt and despair that could strip paint off a shield. But in that odour lay survival, the body's stubborn refusal to surrender. And the thing is, it bonded them, literally and figuratively. Brotherhood wasn't forged in battle. It was forged under one damp blanket while pretending to be asleep. No one who survived that level of shared suffering ever doubted loyalty again. The Vikings didn't talk about it much. You wouldn't either. But every saga of bravery, every tale of conquest, quietly began here, with half-frozen men huddled in the dark, sharing what little warmth they had left. They didn't just survive the cold. They outlasted it, by turning themselves into the fire they didn't have. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't heroic, but it was warm, and that was enough. When you can't feel your fingers, your feet, or your will to live, there's only one thing left to do: start singing. And that's exactly what the Vikings did. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a survival mechanism. When your ship's deck was a frozen plank buffet, and your beard doubled as an icicle collection, singing kept the blood moving and the madness contained. Rhythm gave warmth structure, harmony gave misery company. It was basically Viking therapy, minus the couch and the coping skills. The songs were simple: chants, rowing tunes, war hymns, each one designed to make 20 men pull oars in perfect sync while pretending their joints weren't crystallizing. Some were about gods and glory, others about ale and women, and a few, no doubt, about how much they hated this exact situation. The sagas never mentioned sad sea shanties, but they must have existed. You don't row across the Arctic in silence unless you've already given up on joy. These were working songs, half melody, half grunting, timed to the rhythm of the oars. The result was haunting, primal, and occasionally off-key when someone's lips froze mid-verse. The music wasn't just to pass the time. It unified the crew. The same men who'd argued over stolen rations now harmonized like a choir of freezing psychopaths. Singing drowned out the groans of the ship, the hiss of the wind, and that quiet voice in your head whispering, "You could have stayed home." And when the storms hit, when the sea howled and the sky turned black, they sang louder. Not because it helped, but because it made them feel like they had a say in the matter. There's something beautifully stupid about humans shouting into nature's chaos. A sound that says, if I'm going down, I'm doing it in key. Some say the gods heard those songs. Maybe they did. Or maybe the sound just got lost in the wind. But for the Vikings, that didn't matter. Singing kept the frost at bay, if only in spirit. Because in a world where warmth was a luxury, defiance was the next best thing. And nothing defies the cold quite like a Viking chorus screaming into the storm. For a people who worshipped gods that literally hurled lightning bolts, the Vikings had one very unheroic fear. Fire. Not the poetic, candlelit kind. The real kind. The kind that turns your ship, your home, and your entire crew into a floating Viking barbecue. Fire was warmth, yes, but it was also treachery. You could trust ice. Ice killed you slowly, politely. Fire. Fire killed you loudly. Every Viking ship was soaked in tar, packed with timber, rope, sails, and dreams. Basically everything on the Norse version of a what not to set on fire list. That's why longships never carried open flames. No torches, no bonfires, no romantic candlelight dinners for two warriors and a goat. Instead, they relied on smouldering embers, tiny, manageable, and only slightly less suicidal. Lighting a real fire mid-voyage was the kind of decision that guaranteed you'd be remembered in the sagas. As a warning, it wasn't just about the ship. Fire was sacred. Back home, it lived in the hearth, tended by women, protected by gods, and treated with a reverence modern people usually reserve for Wi-Fi. The hearth fire was the centre of life, cooking, warmth, protection. Extinguishing it was a spiritual offence, like deleting your family's history. At sea, though, the flame belonged to no one. It became wild, dangerous, a god unchained. The Vikings respected that. They feared it. They carried it in small ember boxes, whispering prayers as if to say, "Behave yourself, or we all die." Ironically, their funeral rituals involved the one thing they avoided most. A warrior's final voyage was often a ship burning, the famous pyre on water. Death was the only time a Viking willingly set a ship on fire, because at that point, insurance premiums didn't matter. To the living, the flame was chaos. To the dead, it was release. The same element that doomed a careless sailor was the one that carried heroes to Valhalla. So yes, they feared fire, but they also worshipped it. Because in true Viking logic, if something can destroy you completely, it's probably sacred. And if it kills you quickly, well, that's just good efficiency. If the Vikings had one true religion, it wasn't Odin, Thor, or Freya. It was suffering. The Norse gods got the temples, but pain got the devotion. Endurance wasn't just a virtue, it was a lifestyle. If you complained, you weren't a Viking. You were an inconvenience. In Scandinavia, comfort was suspicious. Warmth made you soft, softness made you weak, and weakness made you French. So from childhood, Vikings were taught that hardship builds character. And by adulthood, they had enough character to survive freezing gales and emotionally repressed friendships. The sagas glorified it. He sailed through snow, they'd boast, bare-armed and laughing. What they didn't mention was that he was probably laughing because the nerves in his skin had died an hour ago. Pain was proof of strength. Cold was proof of masculinity. A Viking wasn't truly alive until something was trying to kill him. Their gods reflected that. Odin sacrificed an eye for wisdom. Tyr lost a hand to a wolf. Even Balder, the god of beauty, was murdered for plot development. To suffer and smile through it. That was divine. The gods didn't bless comfort. They blessed endurance. So the Vikings embraced the cold the way monks embrace silence, with grim enthusiasm and a complete lack of alternatives. They romanticized hardship because it was all they had. Every frostbitten voyage became an act of worship. Every storm endured was a sermon. When the wind howled, they howled back. When the sea froze, they pushed through. When the gods ignored them, they shrugged. They were used to that. Suffering didn't mean the gods had abandoned you. It meant they were paying attention. Modern people chase comfort like it's salvation. Heated homes, soft beds, 12 kinds of tea. A Viking would call that witchcraft. They didn't measure happiness in luxury. They measured it in how long you could keep rowing without crying. And maybe, in some twisted way, they were right. Because while most civilizations prayed for safety, the Vikings prayed for resilience, the strength to face the cold and grin back at it. They didn't just endure the elements, they became them. And if that's not religion, nothing is. So after all the ice, wind, hunger, and questionable life choices, how did the Vikings keep warm without fire? The short answer, they didn't. The long answer, they cheated death through sheer arrogance. For the Vikings, warmth wasn't something you had. It was something you became. They turned endurance into energy, suffering into swagger, and cold into character. They didn't need comfort. They needed challenge. Fire was for weaklings. Frostbite was just proof you'd been somewhere worth bragging about. They wrapped themselves in furs, cloaks, and denial, then called it resilience. They huddled under damp canvas and sang into the wind as if defiance itself generated heat. Maybe it did. Maybe that's why they survived while softer men stayed home, writing poetry about warmer climates. What they lacked in temperature, they made up for in conviction. Their hearts were furnaces, powered by pride, hunger, and an unwavering belief that they were the toughest people alive. And honestly, they were. You try rowing through Arctic storms in a glorified canoe wearing wet wool underwear. They didn't need warmth to live. They needed purpose. Every gust of wind, every frozen wave, every miserable night on the open sea reminded them who they were. People too stubborn to die properly. To freeze quietly was cowardice. To keep rowing was heroism. To make it home was a miracle. And when they finally reached land, blistered, half frozen, half drunk, they didn't curse the cold. They thanked it. The sea had tested them, and they'd survived again. In their minds, the gods hadn't spared them out of mercy. They'd spared them because no one else could take their place. That's the strange beauty of Viking warmth. It wasn't in fires or furs. It was in spirit. In their songs, in their courage, in the way they laughed while nature tried to kill them for sport. Because when your world is ice and iron, true warmth isn't around you. It's inside you, stubborn, blazing, and utterly unkillable. And that's how the Vikings conquered the cold. Not by escaping it, but by becoming colder than the cold itself. The Tudor church wrapped itself in the illusion of holiness. On Sundays, incense curled through cold stone aisles, while sermons thundered against lust, gluttony, and sin. Priests stood before their flocks in spotless vestments, their voices echoing words of purity. Yet behind the sacristy doors, when candles were snuffed and prayers ended, that same church became a theatre of temptation. Human flesh, not doctrine, ruled the night. Celibacy, after all, was an ideal imposed by Rome, not a natural state of being. The clergy were expected to be married to God, but few could resist the touch of the living. In parishes from Canterbury to York, whispers spread of priests who shared their beds with housekeepers, of monks who vanished from the cloister after Compline, and of nuns who dreamed not of Christ but of carnal warmth. Everyone knew. No one said it aloud. Confessionals, meant for repentance, became stages for forbidden intimacy. A young woman would kneel, her breath trembling, as she confessed impure thoughts, only to find her priest listening too closely, his questions a little too curious. "Do you think of him often?" he might ask. And she would answer softly, "Yes, Father." In the dark, both sinner and confessor became mirrors of temptation. The irony was holy men preaching virtue by day and whispering sins by night. For many priests, desire was not rebellion but survival. Parish life was lonely, harsh, and poorly paid. The church demanded chastity but provided no comfort, no warmth beyond the cold company of doctrine. And so they rationalized their lust as weakness, forgivable, even understandable. "God forgives the frailty of man," one priest might mutter after an indiscretion, adjusting his robes before morning mass. Yet the contradiction festered. The church that burned heretics for lesser offences tolerated this quiet hypocrisy. It was not zeal that kept the clergy pure. It was the fear of being caught. And even that fear dulled over time, replaced by familiarity. In the end, purity was just another performance. Robes to hide the body, incense to mask the scent of sin, and sermons to distract the faithful from the human desires pulsing beneath the altar cloth. The Tudor church looked holy. It just didn't smell that way. In the parishes of Tudor England, the word housekeeper had a double meaning. Officially, she was the woman who cooked, cleaned, and tended the priest's household. Unofficially, she was his comfort in the long, lonely nights when Scripture offered little warmth. It was a quiet scandal everyone knew about, from the bishop's palace down to the village tavern. The faithful would nod politely to Mistress Joan or Goodwife Alice, pretending not to notice how the priest's so-called servant shared his bedchamber and bore children who curiously resembled him. The hypocrisy was almost bureaucratic. Bishops fined priests caught in incontinence, but only when the rumours became impossible to ignore. Pay the fine, perform penance, say a few prayers, then return home to the same woman waiting by the fire. The church condemned lust from the pulpit, but quietly tolerated it in the rectory, so long as the tithe money flowed and public scandal stayed manageable. As one chronicler dryly remarked, "The priests will sin, the bishops will sigh, and the people will forgive, for all have need of each other." Some of these relationships were tender, even domestic. A few priests lived openly as husbands without the blessing of marriage, their wives managing the parish as efficiently as any vicar's spouse after the Reformation. Others, however, were more predatory. Power and confession made for dangerous intimacy. A frightened girl seeking spiritual counsel could find herself cornered by the man meant to save her soul. One bishop's report noted with weary resignation that certain clergy take women under colour of service and make them concubines. It was written in Latin, but everyone understood the translation. Lust disguised as duty. Villagers rarely protested. A beloved priest who christened their children and buried their dead could hardly be cast out for human weakness. And in a society already steeped in sin and repentance, who was truly without fault? So long as the sermons continued and the bells rang for Mass, the facade of holiness held firm. But behind the altar, the double life of the Tudor priest thrived. A life where the forbidden felt sacred, where desire found its loophole in confession, and where the church, for all its authority, could never quite silence the pulse of human flesh beneath the cassock. Within the stone walls of Tudor monasteries, the battle between body and spirit was fought daily, and often lost before sunrise. Monks were meant to live as the church's soldiers of purity, rising before dawn, fasting, chanting, and shunning worldly pleasure. But human nature doesn't surrender so easily, not even to God. In the silence of the cloister, where the mind was supposed to dwell on the divine, it often wandered elsewhere, to memories of women, to longing dreams, to the soft scent of the world beyond the walls. For many monks, temptation was not a sudden fall, but a slow erosion. The endless repetition of prayer and ritual dulled the senses, leaving the imagination free to roam where it shouldn't. A pretty pilgrim passing by the abbey gate, a young novice kneeling too close during Vespers. Even such small moments could ignite a storm of guilt and desire. Some monks confessed to seeing demons, others simply admitted to seeing women. Both were treated with suspicion. Records from the period reveal startling honesty. In one visitation report, an abbot wrote that his brothers confessed to carnal fantasies nightly and begged for correction of the flesh. Another admitted that a monk had fled the abbey altogether to live with a brewer's widow. Discipline was swift but rarely effective. A week of fasting, public humiliation, or a cold flogging could not cure what centuries of repression had failed to extinguish. The irony was cruel. The more strictly a man was told to deny his nature, the more it haunted him. Some monks turned their guilt into fanatic devotion, punishing their bodies to silence the voice of desire. Others grew bitter mocking their vows in private, drinking ale behind the garden wall, sneaking out to nearby villages under cover of night. The church called it weakness. They called it survival. When Henry VIII's Reformation came, the dissolution of the monasteries exposed just how human these holy men truly were. Inspectors found lovers, illegitimate children, and secret stashes of ale and gold. The monasteries that once hid the battle between flesh and faith were laid bare, and England discovered that even the most pious robes could not conceal the oldest sin of all, the craving to be touched, to be loved, to be human. The confessional, that narrow wooden box where souls were meant to be cleansed, often became the Tudor Church's most intimate stage for temptation. In theory, it was sacred ground. A priest on one side, a penitent on the other, the veil of secrecy between them. But secrecy, like silence, can breed danger. The boundary between spiritual guidance and personal curiosity was perilously thin, and many priests, already burdened by their own forbidden urges, crossed it far too easily. A confession could begin innocently enough. A young woman whispered that she had impure thoughts about a man, perhaps her husband's friend, or perhaps the priest himself. The priest would press for details, insisting that full honesty was needed for absolution. Her cheeks would flush as she obeyed, unaware that each word she spoke fanned the priest's own forbidden imagination. He might counsel her to pray for purity, or he might linger on the memory long after she left, clutching his rosary like a lifeline against desire. There are accounts of confessors who took advantage of this sacred privacy. Some used their position to manipulate frightened women, promising forgiveness in exchange for favours that could never be spoken aloud. Others convinced themselves they were helping, that understanding sin required experiencing it. It was self-delusion in holy language, lust wearing a halo. Bishops occasionally received complaints, but most were buried with a sigh. The sin was too common, the system too fragile to expose it. Even for the innocent, confession could be torment. Priests trained to extract sin from every soul found that the greatest battlefield was their own mind. Listening to hundreds of whispered temptations, their imaginations became crowded with sin they hadn't committed, but now couldn't stop picturing. One chronicler wrote that priests emerged from the confessional more inflamed than the sinners they absolved, and yet this ritual continued, unquestioned. The faithful still knelt, the priests still listened, and behind the screen, human weakness met divine expectation. The confessional was meant to erase sin, but for many Tudor clergymen it simply recycled it, turning shame into longing, and longing into guilt again. It was a perfect circle of hypocrisy, spinning endlessly under the Church's silent blessing. Behind convent walls, where women vowed to serve only God, love often found its own secret pathways. Tudor nuns were meant to be brides of Christ, chaste, obedient, and detached from the world. Yet convents were rarely as silent or pure as sermons suggested. They were communities of young women, many sent there not out of devotion but convenience. A family might cloister an unruly daughter or hide away an inconvenient pregnancy. And once the gates closed behind them, the struggle between body and faith began. Loneliness was the first intruder. The daily rhythm of prayers, fasting and chores dulled the mind. Eyes lingered too long on a fellow sister's face during hymn practice, or on the visiting priest who heard confessions with gentle patience. Affection, in such a confined world, quickly became dangerous. Letters were smuggled through kitchens and courtyards. A nun might claim she was visiting the garden to gather herbs, but her real harvest waited behind the wall. Historical records, though written with moral outrage, reveal glimpses of forbidden tenderness. One visitation report described 2 nuns found in embraces most unholy. Another spoke of midnight whisperings and fondness beyond sisterhood. The punishments were humiliating: public confession, fasting, or confinement. Yet none of it stopped the pattern. The convent, for some, was not a prison. It was a place where love could hide in plain sight under the language of devotion, and there were those whose sins were far riskier. Some nuns carried on affairs with monks or visiting confessors. A few even became pregnant, their swollen bellies explained away as dropsy or miraculous illness. The shame was usually buried, literally. A sick room, a quiet death, a hurried burial under the cloister stones. God's mercy, it seemed, was quicker when silence served the church. But beneath the hypocrisy was something profoundly human. These women were not villains. They were simply denied the right to be human in the first place. The vows they took were cages built from obedience and isolation. When they broke them, it wasn't just lust, it was rebellion against a system that forbade love itself. In their whispered promises and secret touches, the Tudor nuns lived the one truth the church tried hardest to suppress, that even in holy ground, desire blooms. Love was not supposed to exist in a Tudor convent, at least not the earthly kind. Yet, within the dim candlelight of these walled sanctuaries, hearts rebelled. The rules were clear: obedience to the abbess, silence after vespers, purity above all. But the heart doesn't read canon law. The convent, designed to suppress temptation, instead became an incubator for it. When you lock away youth, beauty, and longing behind stone and prayer, desire doesn't die. It refines itself. Letters of the era describe scenes both tragic and tender. One sister wrote to a monk at a neighbouring abbey, "I see thee only in my prayers, and yet my prayers are full of thee." The letter was intercepted, her punishment severe, a week of fasting and public humiliation. But even after repentance, her affection remained, hidden behind hymns and daily penance. She would later carve a tiny heart beneath the wooden bench of her choir stool, the closest thing she had to a love letter that would last. Visitors from outside the convent only fueled temptation. Merchants, stonemasons, and confessors passed through the gates, bringing news of the world beyond. To young women cloistered since childhood, a kind smile or gentle word could feel divine. Some priests exploited that awe. A confessor might linger too long after hearing sins, offering comfort that quickly crossed the sacred line. One chronicle from 1538 tells of a priest caught sneaking into a convent at night disguised as a pilgrim. His penance was exile, though everyone knew it was hardly his first offence. The Reformation only deepened this crisis. As royal inspectors began dissolving monasteries and convents, they unearthed what polite society had long suspected. Nuns with children, lovers' correspondence, and secret doorways connecting cloisters to nearby parsonages. Henry VIII's agents, eager to discredit Catholic orders, documented every scandal they could find. One report coldly noted, "In the convent of Godstow, more infants were born than psalms were sung." Yet even amid this chaos, not all was corruption. Some of these forbidden romances were genuine, two souls clinging to each other in defiance of a system that denied them affection. It wasn't just lust that flourished behind those walls. It was a quiet, desperate yearning for love, companionship, and freedom. Three things the Church itself had forbidden them to seek. When Henry VIII broke from Rome, the Church of England was born not out of holiness, but out of lust. And the hypocrisy was too rich to ignore. Here was a king demanding spiritual independence so he could divorce his wife and marry another, while his bishops preached chastity from gilded pulpits. The Reformation wasn't only a political revolution, it was a mass unmasking of clerical sin. Suddenly, the very men who had condemned others for impurity found themselves stripped of their own illusions of virtue. Royal inspectors, dispatched to dissolve monasteries and convents, uncovered scandal after scandal. They reported monks living with wives, priests fathering children, and nuns whose miraculous ailments turned out to be pregnancies. Henry's agents exaggerated, of course. Every sin they found served as justification to seize more church property. But the seeds of truth were undeniable. The Tudor clergy had been preaching against temptation while drowning in it. Lust, it seemed, had done more damage to Rome's authority than any sermon could. The hypocrisy extended from the pulpit to the throne. Henry himself justified his affairs by invoking divine will, declaring that God wanted him to have a male heir, no matter how many wives or mistresses it took. Courtiers took the hint. Bishops blessed the king's unions and annulments with rehearsed piety, each one pretending that scripture somehow agreed. Behind the mask of reform was a court obsessed with pleasure, gossip, and power, draped in the thin veil of religious duty. Common folk watched all this with weary amusement. The village priest still kept his housekeeper. The abbey walls still whispered with desire. Only now, the crown, not the Pope, collected the confessions. The Reformation didn't purge lust from the church, it nationalised it. The same men who once whispered Latin prayers now toasted English queens, swapping faith for favour, robes for gold, and vows for politics. In the end, Henry's break with Rome revealed what everyone had always known, but few dared to say: that the Tudor Church's greatest sin wasn't lust itself, but the denial of it. For centuries, desire had been the secret heartbeat beneath the hymns, and when the Reformation came, it simply tore off the cassock, exposing the flesh that had always been there, trembling beneath the illusion of divine control. After Henry's break from Rome, the pulpits of England thundered with new authority. Priests, now loyal to the crown rather than the Pope, proclaimed a purer, holier church. But for all the talk of reform, the sermons still smelled faintly of hypocrisy, and sometimes of perfume. The men who denounced Catholic corruption often carried their own brand of temptation under their robes. The cassock might have changed allegiance, but not appetite. Many clergy used their newfound freedom to live more openly, no longer hiding their lovers behind the title of housekeeper. Marriage for priests, once condemned, was suddenly permissible, but old habits die hard. Some took wives yet continued to seek pleasure elsewhere. Others, emboldened by reform, turned their sermons into spectacles of moral superiority, warning their congregations against the very sins they indulged in privately. The louder a man preached about purity, the more likely it was that he had something to hide. Records from parish courts are full of such contradictions. One minister was fined for incontinence with several women of his parish, another caught in bed with the wife of a churchwarden. Even bishops were not exempt. In 1551, the Bishop of Gloucester was accused of keeping a concubine under guise of a laundress. The irony was practically divine. The Church had broken from Rome in pursuit of moral clarity, yet found itself repeating the same old farce, only now in English. The people, however, were not fooled. In taverns and marketplaces, they mocked the clergy with bitter humour. "Our parson," one ballad joked, "preaches hellfire but keeps a warm bed." Satirical plays lampooned lecherous friars and hypocritical preachers, while pamphlets circulated with drawings of priests caught in scandalous embraces. The Reformation, meant to cleanse the faith, had instead turned sin into entertainment, and still the Church endured, its priests forgiven, its followers resigned. Desire had proven stronger than dogma, more enduring than any decree. Even as sermons thundered about temptation, the pulpit itself became a monument to it. For beneath every moral command was a confession unspoken, that holiness and hunger were never enemies, only uneasy companions. The Tudor Church had not eradicated lust. It had simply learned to preach over it, louder, longer, and with better lighting. By the late Tudor years, lust and holiness had learned to coexist, awkwardly but inevitably. The Church had changed its robes, rewritten its prayers, and buried its scandals beneath new laws, yet human nature refused to obey theology. Behind every sermon on purity still lingered the ghost of temptation. Even the most righteous clergyman, standing before his flock in candlelit sanctity, carried within him the same conflict that haunted monks, priests, and nuns before him. The pull between the flesh and the faith. The irony was almost poetic. The Reformation had promised a church freed from corruption, a moral cleansing of England's soul. But in truth, it only shifted the sin from confessionals to courts, from monasteries to royal chambers. Lust had not been defeated. It had been redistributed. The crown married and remarried. Courtiers traded favours in bedrooms as easily as in council halls, and priests continued to wrestle with the very desires they condemned. The Tudor age, so obsessed with sin, was paradoxically one of its most fertile breeding grounds. Yet this conflict gave the era its peculiar humanity. The Tudor clergy, for all their hypocrisy, reflected the same contradictions found in every believer. They wanted to be pure, but they also wanted to be loved. They preached eternal salvation, but they longed for mortal warmth. The robes and rituals could disguise desire, but they could not erase it. And so the Church, in all its grandeur and guilt, became a mirror of England itself, proud, pious, and perpetually tempted. When the final Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I, ascended the throne, she embodied this balance perfectly. The Virgin Queen ruled a nation drenched in gossip about her lovers. Her court sparkled with poetry and passion. Her priests preached restraint, while musicians sang of longing. Holiness had become theatre, and the audience adored every act. In the end, the hidden lusts of the Tudor Church were not just sins, they were symptoms of being human. Beneath the hymns, beneath the robes, beneath the fear of eternal fire, beat the same unyielding truth. That desire, however forbidden, was part of creation itself. And though priests might burn for it, kings reform for it, and the faithful confess it. Lust remained England's truest religion, the one faith the Tudor Church could never fully exorcise. Long before the roar of engines or the clang of railways, the ancient Silk Road pulsed with the slow, rhythmic shuffle of camel hooves. It was not one single road, but a sprawling network, a web of dirt and dust stretching from the great cities of China to the glittering ports of the Mediterranean. Silk, jade, and spices travelled west. Gold, glass, and stories flowed east. But none of it could have happened without one vital invention, the Caravanserais, the fortress of the traveller. Imagine trudging for days through the Gobi Desert. The wind bites, your lips crack, and the sand swallows every sound. Then, on the horizon, you see it. Thick stone walls rising from the emptiness, a torchlit gate promising food, safety, and company. To step inside a caravanserai was to step out of danger. For the merchant, it was sanctuary. For the monk, it was a place to preach. For the spy, it was a chance to listen. Each caravanserai was more than a rest stop. It was a world condensed within walls. Built a day's journey apart, roughly 30 to 40 kilometres, they formed the vertebrae of the Silk Road's spine. The architecture spoke of both function and culture. Heavy gates to withstand raids, inner courtyards wide enough for caravans, fountains to wash off desert dust, and prayer halls for weary souls. Guards watched the gates, while stable hands tended to camels and horses, their bells chiming softly through the night. But what made these places extraordinary was not the architecture. It was the humanity that filled them. Persian poets traded verses with Chinese scholars. Turkish nomads haggled with Venetian merchants over bolts of silk. Languages collided, religions mingled, and recipes, maps, and rumours passed from mouth to mouth. The Caravanserai was a crossroad of civilizations, part inn, part market, part university, and part whisper network. Here, globalization was born not from ambition, but from necessity, from the shared struggle of surviving deserts, mountains, and men. The Silk Road's treasures shimmered not just in gold and silk, but in the ideas carried from one firelit courtyard to another. Every caravanserai was a heart, beating quietly, faithfully, keeping the lifeblood of the ancient world flowing between east and west. Each caravanserai stood like a defiant island in a sea of dust, a fortress of hospitality amid endless wilderness. From Anatolia to Persia, from the steppes of Samarkand to the oases of China's Taklamakan desert, these roadside inns were built with the same purpose, to protect life and commerce. No matter where a traveller came from, the sight of high walls and a heavy wooden gate meant safety, warmth, and a meal that wasn't dried camel jerky. Architecturally, caravanserais were feats of ingenuity. Most had a single massive gate that closed at sunset. Once shut, no one entered or left until dawn. Inside lay a wide courtyard where merchants unloaded goods, bales of silk, spices in clay jars, sacks of saffron, and cages filled with parrots from India or falcons from Arabia. Along the walls were rows of arched chambers, some used as sleeping quarters, others as stables. The central fountain or well provided water for both men and beasts, its sound mingling with the clatter of hooves and the murmur of dozens of languages. The design reflected both practicality and power. Caravanserais along Persian routes were often fortified, doubling as military outposts. In Ottoman lands, sultans commissioned massive stone khans that looked more like castles than inns, symbols of royal protection over trade. Even the Mongols, masters of the open plain, built waystations where silk caravans could rest under guard, knowing that peace on the road meant profit for all. But beyond walls and gates, the atmosphere inside was electric. Nightfall transformed each caravanserai into a miniature city. Merchants compared prices by torchlight, musicians strummed lutes, and storytellers recited epics of kings and gods to an audience of traders half asleep on rugs. Here, a Chinese Buddhist might share tea with an Armenian jeweler, while a Persian poet debated scripture with a Syrian monk. Languages collided, and with them, ideas, artistic, religious, scientific. These inns were more than structures, they were engines of civilization. Every caravanserai was a spark in the great web of human exchange, a node connecting worlds that would otherwise never meet. Behind those thick, dust-stained walls, globalization wasn't a modern concept. It was nightly routine, fueled by spice, story, and survival. Before dawn, the caravan stirred. Bells jingled, camels groaned, and men shouted in a dozen languages as torches flickered against the caravanserai's inner walls. The merchants of the Silk Road were the lifeblood of this ancient highway, a restless fraternity of traders, dreamers, and gamblers who risked everything for the promise of profit and prestige. They came from everywhere: China, India, Persia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Some carried silk and porcelain, others sold glass, wool, or gold. What united them was not faith or origin, but the endless road itself. A typical caravan could include hundreds of animals and dozens of men. Camels were the ships of the desert, patient, smelly, and indispensable. Horses carried couriers, donkeys hauled smaller loads, and guards rode at the flanks with curved sabres glinting in the sunrise. Each merchant had a role. The leader, or caravanbashi, set the pace and managed disputes. Scribes recorded transactions in careful ink, and cooks prepared flatbread, stew, and dried fruit to feed the company. To travel the Silk Road was to live as one organism, bound by trade and trust. Within the safety of a caravanserai, rival traders might share a meal, swap stories, or strike a bargain that would ripple across continents. A Persian spice dealer might sell cardamom to an Italian merchant, who would later carry it by ship to Venice, where nobles would sprinkle it on their feasts as a symbol of wealth. A Chinese silk master might trade bolts of embroidered fabric for Arabian glassware, delicate, shimmering, and coveted back home. In this way, entire economies depended on these nightly exchanges under foreign stars. But travel was perilous. Bandits stalked the mountain passes, sandstorms swallowed entire convoys, and illness struck without warning. Caravanserais were the fragile link between survival and oblivion. To reach one by nightfall was a victory. To miss it was to gamble with death. And so, every merchant's map was inked, not only with routes, but with names of inns, havens that offered protection, warmth, and rumour. For these traders, the road was more than commerce. It was destiny. They were the arteries of the ancient world, carrying goods, gossip, and gods across deserts and empires. Each caravanserai was their heartbeat, pulsing, echoing, keeping civilization alive one weary step at a time. If the desert was silent, the caravanserai was its opposite, a storm of voices, laughter, and rumour echoing through the night. By day, it was a fortress. By night, a parliament of the world. Merchants, monks, envoys and wanderers gathered around fires, trading not only goods but secrets. A caravanserai was a marketplace of information, where the fates of empires could be whispered over a bowl of lentil stew. News travelled faster here than on any royal road. A merchant from Samarkand might arrive with word that the Khan of the East was raising taxes. A Persian courier would swear that the Ottoman Sultan was preparing for war. A monk from India might murmur of a new sect, while a trader from Venice reported that silver prices had fallen across the sea. Every story was part truth, part invention, and every listener became both student and spy. In an age without newspapers, Caravanserais were the world's wireless network, dusty, noisy, and utterly indispensable. The gossip didn't stop with politics. There were tales of bandits and ghosts that haunted certain passes, of lost caravans swallowed by dunes, of kings who paid in pearls, and emperors who collected mechanical birds. These stories drifted west with the merchants and east with the monks, mixing with legend until rumour became history. Even myths had mileage. A traveller could leave China hearing of dragons, and arrive in Persia believing they'd been spotted. For many, the gossip was more valuable than the trade itself. Monks learned of distant shrines and relics, explorers gathered hints of new lands, rulers sent spies disguised as merchants to listen and report. A well-placed rumour could bankrupt a rival or spark an alliance. The innkeeper, often overlooked, became the gatekeeper of this invisible empire, his ears sharper than any sword, his memory more dangerous than any army. But beneath all the chatter lay something deeper. Connection. The Caravanserai was the one place where enemies could eat from the same pot, where a Christian could share wine with a Muslim, and where a Buddhist could trade blessings for salt. In the flicker of lamplight, the divisions of empires blurred, replaced by a common truth that every traveller understood. The road was long, the world vast, and survival required both trade and trust. Long before merchants brought silk to Rome or spices to Venice, monks carried something even more enduring: ideas. Along the Silk Road, the caravanserais became unlikely monasteries of the moment, spiritual pit stops where faiths met, mingled, and sometimes collided. Here, under the same roof, one might find a Buddhist monk from Nalanda, a Nestorian priest from Mesopotamia, a Sufi mystic from Persia, and a Taoist scholar on pilgrimage. They arrived by camel, on foot, or in ox-drawn carts, bound not by trade but by revelation. The road was their scripture. Each inn was a verse. And every night their prayers rose together in a dozen tongues. In these shared courtyards, debate flourished, not about gold or silk, but about the soul. The Buddhist monk spoke of compassion and detachment. The Christian priest of redemption and grace. The Sufi whispered of divine love hidden in the folds of existence. The air buzzed with words as incense smoke curled between languages. Sometimes faiths clashed, other times they simply fused. It was in places like these that Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia and China, carried by monks who followed the same routes as the traders. Caravanserais gave them food, protection, and, most importantly, an audience. A weary merchant might listen to a monk's parable after dinner, and remember it long after the spices were sold. Likewise, Christian missionaries from the Middle East used the same shelters to reach the steppes, carving crosses on the walls beside older inscriptions in Sanskrit or Persian. The walls of some surviving inns still bear those marks, a silent record of theology in transit. Even the most practical of travellers often left with a touch of philosophy. The road demanded it. To face the desert's emptiness was to confront the divine. And so, between the buying and selling, men began to question the meaning of their journeys. What if the road itself was the teacher and every stop a lesson? The Caravanserai, for all its bustle, became a place of quiet transformation. Not only goods, but gods were exchanged here, reshaped, reimagined, and carried onward. Beneath its vaulted arches, faith became a traveller too, wearing the dust of many lands and the language of many hearts. Though history often remembers the Silk Road as a man's world of merchants and monks, women were its quiet architects, unseen but indispensable. Behind every caravan's success was a web of wives, daughters, and innkeepers who kept trade alive when the men were gone. In the Caravanserais, where the weary met the waiting, women's presence shaped the rhythm of the road as much as gold or silk ever did. Some were merchants in their own right. Central Asian women, especially among Turkic and Mongol tribes, managed trade caravans, owned inns, and negotiated contracts with travellers. A skilled trader's wife might sit cross-legged in a shaded corner of a caravanserai courtyard, haggling fiercely over a roll of brocade or a bag of saffron. Their authority was earned through reputation, and in a world without borders, reputation travelled fast. Others worked within the inns themselves, cooks, hostesses, or keepers of the stables, ensuring that every traveller, rich or poor, found a place to rest and eat. Then there were the storytellers, dancers, and musicians, women whose songs echoed through the courtyards after dusk. Their performances were payment and prayer at once, soothing the tired, charming the lonely, and spreading fragments of distant cultures. A dancer from Samarkand might wear Indian jewellery, perform Persian steps, and sing verses in Arabic, her art as fluid as the road itself. Through them, cultures didn't just trade goods, they traded rhythm, beauty, and myth. Even noble women found their place in the network. Royal wives and princesses from Persia or Mongolia sponsored caravanserais as acts of faith and generosity, ensuring that travellers, including monks and pilgrims, found safe lodging. Some of these inns bore their names, their legacies carved into stone lintels where caravans once passed beneath. But the road was also dangerous. Women faced risks far greater than exhaustion or hunger, bandits, exploitation, or the slow erasure of their stories. Yet their resilience was astonishing. They adapted, traded, entertained, prayed and endured, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the Silk Road's life. Without them, the caravanserai would have been only stone. It was women who filled it with warmth, laughter, and language, who turned cold walls into homes and transformed the journey into a living story that still hums beneath the dust of the ancient road. Every caravanserai was built for survival, yet designed with surprising grace. To the traveller, its walls meant safety. To the builder, they were symbols of divine duty, an offering to both God and guest. From Anatolia's honey-coloured stone hands to Persia's sun-baked courtyards and China's timbered way stations, the architecture of these inns reflected not only geography but philosophy. Each one said, in its own language of arches and domes, "You are safe here, stranger." The typical design followed a rhythm perfected over centuries. A single monumental gate faced the road, often carved with verses invoking blessings for travellers. Once inside, a wide rectangular courtyard opened, flanked by rows of vaulted chambers. The lower rooms housed camels, donkeys and horses. The upper ones sheltered merchants and pilgrims. In the centre, a fountain or well shimmered under open sky, feeding both thirst and spirit. Water was sacred, and so it flowed through channels and basins, cooling the dusty air as traders unpacked their treasures. In colder regions, some caravanserais enclosed their courtyards completely, with domed roofs pierced by narrow skylights. In the desert, thick mud-brick walls kept the interior cool by day and warm by night. Builders understood the language of climate, a harmony between form and function that modern architects still admire. Many caravanserais even had small mosques or shrines built into their corners, where travellers of every faith could pray. Hospitality, after all, was not merely kindness, it was law. Decoration told another story. Stucco carvings, turquoise tiles, calligraphy, and geometric patterns adorned the walls, proof that even in remote deserts, beauty mattered. A Persian caravanserai might display Quranic inscriptions about generosity, while a Central Asian one bore stylized lions and suns, symbols of protection. These designs spoke across cultures, expressing one universal truth, a shared reverence for the traveller's journey. But perhaps the greatest artistry was invisible, the feeling of arrival. After days of heat, hunger and uncertainty, stepping into the cool shade of a caravanserai was like stepping into civilization itself. It was more than a building, it was a promise. Within those walls, strangers became guests, and weary men became part of something vast and connected. The architecture was stone, but the message was human, that even in the harshest places, there would always be room for you. For nearly 2,000 years, the Silk Road thrived, a thread of trade, faith, and friendship stretching across half the world. But even the strongest silk frays with time. By the 15th century, the same caravanserais that once pulsed with laughter and languages began to fall silent. Their courtyards, once crowded with camels and spice carts, echoed only with wind and the occasional traveller too stubborn to believe the world had moved on. The first blow came from the sea. When European explorers discovered maritime routes to India and China, the overland roads suddenly became slower, riskier, and less profitable. A ship could carry 100 times the cargo of a caravan, and no sandstorm ever swallowed a galleon. Merchants who once crossed Persia and Central Asia now sailed around Africa, trading silk for silver in bustling ports instead of barren deserts. The caravanserais, built to guard against bandits and thirst, could not defend against obsolescence. Then came war. The Mongol peace that had once protected traders gave way to fractured kingdoms and raiding tribes. Empires rose and fell faster than merchants could redraw their maps. Taxes multiplied, roads became unsafe, and many inns were abandoned, left to crumble beneath centuries of sand. Those that survived became villages, prisons, or ruins inhabited by shepherds and ghosts. The Silk Road's arteries dried up, and the heart, the caravanserai, ceased to beat. Yet decline did not mean disappearance. In the quiet courtyards of these ruins, traces of the past still linger. Faded inscriptions in Persian and Arabic speak of hospitality and divine protection. Burn marks on stone recall the fires that once warmed travellers from a dozen kingdoms. Even now, wanderers who visit these remnants feel a strange familiarity. The echo of footsteps, the imagined scent of spices, the soft murmur of traders counting coins by lamplight. The caravanserais may have fallen, but their legacy survived in new forms. In the roadside inns of Europe, the khans of the Ottoman Empire, and the modern hotels that still promise comfort to strangers. The Silk Road's dust may have settled, but its spirit of exchange, the will to connect across distance, endures. The world learned from its fall that even when roads end, the stories carried upon them never do. Today, the caravanserais of the Silk Road stand like scattered bones of a forgotten giant, silent, weathered, and half-swallowed by sand. Their walls crumble, but their memory endures in the DNA of our modern world. Every airport lounge, roadside motel, and border cafe owes something to these ancient sanctuaries of exchange. They were the first global network, not of cables or code, but of people. And in their courtyards, the world first learned how to connect. Step into one of these ruins today, perhaps along the dusty plains of Uzbekistan or the red hills of Iran, and you'll feel it, that strange pulse of history. You can almost hear the faint jangle of camel bells, smell the spice of cardamom and sweat, and catch the ghostly laughter of merchants from lands that no longer exist. The stone may be broken, but the idea, the radical ancient belief in hospitality and curiosity, remains intact. Civilization itself was carried not by armies, but by travellers who shared a meal with strangers. Modern archaeologists call the caravanserai an infrastructure of globalization. But it was far more intimate than that. It was humanity's first chat room, its first international market, its first peace treaty signed by necessity. Within its walls, differences blurred under the same roof of survival. It was here that cultures collided not with swords, but with stories. And the Silk Road became more than a trade route. It became a classroom for empathy. Governments today dream of reviving the Silk Road through railways and highways, but the truest revival is spiritual, in the recognition that connection, not conquest, built civilizations. The caravanserai's lesson is as simple as it is timeless, that the stranger who knocks at your gate may carry more than goods. They may carry the future. As the sun sinks over the ruins, The shadows of the old arches stretch long across the sand, as if reaching for travellers who will never return. Yet in a way, we are all still walking that road. Every message sent, every journey taken, every trade made across oceans and screens. The Silk Road never truly vanished. It simply changed form. The Caravanserais lives on, in every welcome, every exchange, and every shared fire between strangers under the same eternal sky. In the summer of 1325, a 21-year-old law student from Tangier packed his saddlebags, mounted his horse, and rode east, alone. His name was Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Battuta, and he claimed he was setting out for Mecca to complete the pilgrimage every Muslim must make at least once in life. But what began as a holy duty would turn into the most extraordinary journey of the medieval world, one that would carry him across Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. Over nearly 30 years, he would travel more than 75,000 miles, a distance no known explorer before him had ever matched. Ibn Battuta's world was vast yet connected, stitched together by the golden threads of Islamic trade routes and hospitality. From Morocco's Atlantic coast to the heart of Central Asia, an invisible network of inns, scholars, mosques and markets welcomed any traveller who spoke the greeting, Assalamu alaikum. Wherever he went, the faith that united this world guaranteed him shelter, safety, and often opportunity. The son of a family of judges, Ibn Battuta knew how to read, write, and argue the law, skills that would open many doors before him. His first destination was Mecca, but as he later wrote, "I set out alone, without companion or caravan, for the love of travel was implanted in my soul by God." He joined merchant caravans across North Africa, endured thirst and illness, and narrowly escaped Bedouin raids. But every hardship drew him further from home and deeper into history. By the time he reached Cairo, he had already crossed kingdoms and deserts, and something had changed. The pilgrimage was no longer enough. The world itself had become his calling. In Cairo, he marvelled at a city that never slept, a place where scholars debated, markets roared, and mosques gleamed like palaces. It was here that Ibn Battuta's curiosity began to overshadow his piety. He listened to sailors' tales of India's riches, merchant stories of golden Mali, and envoys speaking of faraway China. Each rumour became an invitation, and so the pilgrim became a wanderer. What began as a journey toward Mecca turned into a lifetime across the known world, not in search of gold or empire, but of knowledge, faith, and the endless wonder of human connection. The road to Mecca was not a single trail. It was a gauntlet. As Ibn Battuta crossed North Africa, the Sahara loomed like a shimmering mirage of death. Caravans vanished in its endless dunes, their bones swallowed by wind and time. To survive meant discipline, faith, and luck. Three things Ibn Battuta would come to depend on for the rest of his life. He travelled first through Algeria and Tunisia, sleeping in mosques or with Sufi scholars who offered shelter to any pilgrim bound for the holy city. The desert was vast but not empty. Along its arteries pulsed a steady rhythm of trade and faith. Camel trains carrying salt, gold and silks, dervishes spinning in prayer at roadside shrines, merchants whispering verses from the Quran before setting out at dawn. In this world, religion was both compass and currency. A man who prayed was a man to be trusted. Still, danger was constant. Sandstorms struck without warning, turning daylight into chaos. Thieves stalked lonely paths, waiting for the sound of bells or hooves. Ibn Battuta's small group was once ambushed near the Libyan frontier. He survived only by hiding beneath a dead camel until nightfall. In his later writings, he would call such moments tests of endurance sent by God. But even in fear, he found beauty. The desert at sunset, he wrote, burned like gold before the mercy of night cooled its fire. By the time he reached Alexandria, Ibn Battuta was no longer merely a pilgrim. He had become part of a vast living network of scholars, travellers, and storytellers stretching from the Maghreb to Arabia. He met holy men who claimed visions of Mecca, sailors who swore they'd seen islands made of perfume, and students reciting poetry in the courtyards of mosques. Their stories filled him with an intoxicating hunger to see more. From Alexandria he journeyed down the Nile, marvelling at the ancient monuments of Egypt and the bustling river towns where Coptic Christians and Muslim traders lived side by side. Every stop revealed a world bigger than the one he had imagined in Tangier. The road to Mecca was still ahead, but the true pilgrimage had already begun, not toward a city, but toward the infinite horizons of the human world. When Ibn Battuta finally reached Mecca, after more than a year of perilous travel, he felt he had arrived not just at the centre of Islam, but at the heart of the world. The city was alive with faith and motion. Thousands of pilgrims from Africa, Persia, India, and Anatolia, all circling the Kaaba in perfect rhythm. It was a living map of the medieval world, drawn not with ink, but with footsteps and prayer. For Ibn Battuta, the pilgrimage fulfilled his religious duty, but it also opened his imagination. Mecca was more than a sacred city. It was a crossroads. Merchants traded silk beside spices. Scholars debated law in the shade of palm trees. Poets recited verses under oil lamps until dawn. Every man here carried a story from another land, and Ibn Battuta wanted to hear them all. He began recording his experiences, noting customs, dialects, and the subtle ways Islam shaped local life. Even in uniformity, he saw infinite diversity. After months in Mecca, most pilgrims turned home. Ibn Battuta did not. The world was calling. He joined caravans heading north toward Iraq and Persia, determined to see the lands of ancient empires. His journey took him through the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, where the ruins of Babylon lay buried beneath dust, and onward to Baghdad, a city still glowing with the memory of the Abbasid caliphs. Though the Mongols had sacked it less than a century before, Baghdad remained a beacon of learning, its madrasas filled with scholars from across the Islamic world. There, Ibn Battuta met judges, philosophers and poets, trading ideas as eagerly as merchants traded goods. His sharp intellect and deep knowledge of Islamic law earned him respect wherever he went, and soon invitations began to follow, from governors, sultans and scholars who saw in him a rare mix of piety and curiosity. For Ibn Battuta, travel had become both worship and education. Every road was a verse in the book of creation, every stranger a teacher. Standing on the banks of the Tigris, watching the sunset shimmer over the ruins of an empire, he began to grasp his purpose. He was not merely crossing borders. He was mapping the soul of the world, one journey at a time. By the time Ibn Battuta reached Persia, he was no longer simply a pilgrim or traveller. He was becoming a scholar of the world. His reputation as a learned man of law, combined with his charm and eloquence, opened doors wherever he went. He stayed in mosques and palaces alike, debating theology one day and dining with princes the next. For a man born in the far corner of Africa, he now found himself moving through the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age. Persia dazzled him. He crossed cities still shimmering from the legacy of the Mongols, now ruled by the Ilkhanate dynasty, where Persian artistry had blended with Central Asian grandeur. In Tabriz, he marvelled at markets overflowing with Chinese silks, Indian spices, and Damascus steel. Proof that the old Silk Road still pulsed with life. In Shiraz, he met poets and jurists who recited verses of Sa'di and Hafez, blending poetry with faith. To Ibn Battuta, it was not only a place of wealth, but of wisdom. A land where intellect and beauty shared the same language. His journey continued eastward, through the mountains of Afghanistan, and into the fabled cities of Khorasan and Herat, where he witnessed how Mongol destruction had slowly given way to rebirth. Everywhere he went, he recorded what he saw, the way people dressed, how they prayed, what they ate, and how they governed. His travel notes, later compiled as the Rihla, the Journey, would become a mirror reflecting the connectedness of the medieval world. But knowledge could not protect him from danger. In one desert crossing, his caravan was attacked by bandits. He lost all his belongings and nearly his life. Yet he pressed on, interpreting every trial as divine instruction. When he finally reached the great city of Delhi, he arrived not as a beggar, but as a man who carried with him the wisdom of a continent. The Sultan of Delhi, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, was fascinated by this Moroccan wanderer and appointed him as a royal judge, an honour few foreigners had ever achieved. Ibn Battuta had crossed from pilgrim to scholar, from scholar to statesman. Yet even in power, he remained restless. The horizon still called, and beyond India, the world awaited. In Delhi, Ibn Battuta entered a world of both magnificence and madness. The city was a glittering capital, swollen with palaces, mosques and markets overflowing with colour. But at its centre ruled one of the most unpredictable monarchs in history, Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, a man of immense intellect and even greater cruelty. Scholars called him brilliant, survivors called him dangerous. For Ibn Battuta, serving at this court would prove both a blessing and a trial. The Sultan appointed him as a qadi, or judge, granting him wealth, servants, and a fine house. Overnight, the young man from Tangier became a figure of influence, sitting beside viziers and generals in the court of one of the richest empires on earth. The Sultan, impressed by Ibn Battuta's knowledge of Islamic law and his gift for diplomacy, often called on him to mediate disputes or represent the court in foreign affairs. But beneath the golden ceremony lurked a deep unease. Delhi was a city of spies, where favour could vanish overnight, and disobedience was punished with torture or death. In his Rihla, Ibn Battuta describes the Sultan as a man of vast ambitions and swift anger. He witnessed acts of generosity, entire streets fed from royal kitchens, followed by acts of terror when the same kitchens ran red with executions. One day, the Sultan ordered a gift of gold coins to be distributed to the poor. The next, he commanded the exile of 100 nobles for imagined betrayal. To live in his shadow was to walk a tightrope between fortune and ruin. Still, Ibn Battuta navigated this perilous world with remarkable skill. His charisma and learning kept him in favour, and his curiosity never waned. He explored Delhi's markets, observed its festivals, and recorded the mingling of Persian, Turkic, and Indian traditions that made the city unique. Yet comfort could not tame his wanderlust. The court was rich, but it was also a cage. Sensing his restlessness, the Sultan offered him a new challenge, to serve as ambassador to China. It was both an honour and a subtle dismissal. Ibn Battuta accepted eagerly. For a man born to movement, the thought of the open road was irresistible. Delhi had crowned him with prestige, but his heart still belonged to the horizon. In 1342, Ibn Battuta set out from Delhi as the Sultan's ambassador to China, leading a grand caravan of servants, scholars, and sailors. The mission was meant to strengthen trade and diplomacy between two great empires, the Delhi Sultanate and the Yuan dynasty. For Ibn Battuta, it was the perfect excuse to keep moving eastward. Yet destiny had other plans. What awaited him was not glory, but chaos. A journey through monsoon seas, mutiny, and near death. He first travelled down to the port of Calicut, on India's southwestern coast, where the air was thick with the scent of pepper and salt. The harbour teemed with ships from Arabia, Africa and China, a floating city of languages and cargo. The Indian Ocean trade routes were the highways of the medieval world, connecting East Africa to Indonesia. But they were also treacherous, ruled by wind and water. Ibn Battuta boarded a Chinese-style junk bound for the Malabar coast, and soon met the fury of the monsoon. The storm struck like judgment. Waves rose higher than minarets, and the wind howled like a beast. His fleet was torn apart. One of the ships carrying royal gifts sank with all hands, while another was seized by pirates. Ibn Battuta himself barely escaped drowning, washing ashore half dead, his clothes torn, his mission ruined. He had set out as an ambassador. Now he was a vagabond once more, yet despair never conquered him. He wrote later that every disaster was a mercy in disguise. Stranded but alive, he began again, travelling south along India's coast and then sailing to the Maldive Islands, where fate took another strange turn. The islanders, impressed by his learning, invited him to stay, and within months he was appointed chief judge. In true Ibn Battuta fashion, he also married into the royal family. For nearly 2 years, he lived amid palm trees and coral mosques, settling disputes about fishing rights and dowries instead of dynasties. But peace never suited him for long. The ocean still called, loud as a drumbeat in his soul. When he finally left the Maldives, he had lost his fortune, but regained his purpose. The storm had stripped away everything but what mattered most, the will to keep moving, wherever the horizon led. Leaving the Maldives behind, Ibn Battuta turned eastward again, this time toward the spice ports of Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia. The sea, which had nearly claimed his life before, now became his highway. The monsoon winds carried him across a web of trade routes that connected the medieval world's greatest civilizations: Arabia, India, China, and Africa. Every port he reached was a new language, a new faith, and a new rhythm of life. He visited Ceylon, where legends said Adam himself had descended to earth, leaving his footprint atop a sacred mountain. Ibn Battuta climbed it barefoot, moved by its mix of Islamic, Hindu, and Buddhist devotion. To him, this was the proof of Islam's universality, faith adapting, blending, and surviving at the edges of the known world. In his writings, he described the island's lush forests, jeweled kings, and elephant caravans, marveling at how the tropical rain could drown the horizon in moments. From there, he sailed to the Malacca Strait, where merchants from China, Sumatra, and Arabia met to trade pepper, silk, and porcelain. The air was thick with humidity and gossip. Ships from every coast anchored side by side, their decks laden with goods and guarded by men whose faces showed every shade of the known world. Here, Ibn Battuta saw a level of global exchange that few medieval Europeans could have imagined. A multicultural sea bound not by borders, but by wind and trust. But the ocean remained unpredictable. Pirates roamed the waters, storms struck without warning, and navigation relied on the stars and memory. He survived by faith and reputation. As a Qadi and holy man, he was protected by the very networks of Islam that stretched from Morocco to China. Wherever he went, there were mosques, scholars, and merchants ready to greet him with the same familiar words of peace. By now, Ibn Battuta had out-travelled nearly every man alive. What had begun as a pilgrimage had transformed into something much greater, an unending exploration of the world's diversity under the unity of faith. As his ship set sail toward China, he looked east across the horizon, the final frontier of his odyssey, where the rising sun promised both wonder and peril. In 1346, after decades on the road, Ibn Battuta finally reached China, the eastern edge of the known world. Few Muslim travellers before him had journeyed so far, and even fewer returned to tell the tale. To him, it was like stepping into another planet, ordered, immense, and astonishingly advanced. Cities stretched farther than the eye could see, rivers swarmed with boats, and markets overflowed with porcelain, silk, and spices. China was not just a land, it was a civilization that moved with clockwork precision. He entered through the southern ports of Quanzhou and Guangzhou, where Arab and Persian traders had long built thriving communities. There, mosques stood beside pagodas, and the call to prayer mingled with the clang of temple bells. To Ibn Battuta, this coexistence was proof that Islam had reached even the farthest corners of the earth. He marvelled at Chinese craftsmanship, describing their paper money, intricate bridges, and artful ships, some with multiple decks and watertight compartments, unmatched by anything in the Indian Ocean. Yet China also bewildered him. Its customs were alien, its people disciplined to the point of silence. "They have no religion of revelation," he wrote with both fascination and unease. Still, he admired their justice, their organisation, and the cleanliness of their cities, qualities he compared favourably to the great capitals of the Muslim world. He visited Hangzhou, calling it the largest city under heaven, and Beijing, where the Mongol emperors ruled from vast golden halls. Everywhere he went, he found traces of the global world he had spent his life exploring. Arab merchants in the harbours, Persian doctors at court, African sailors in the docks. China was not isolated. It was connected, humming at the far end of the same network that began in Morocco. Ibn Battuta, standing in the Empire of the Dragon, had followed that thread to its very end. But the road, at last, had begun to tire him. His beard was grey, his body scarred by travel and time. After nearly 30 years away, the longing for home stirred stronger than his curiosity. The man who had set out to see the world's wonders had finally seen them all, and now, for the first time, he wished only to return to where his journey began. By the time Ibn Battuta turned westward, he was no longer the young pilgrim who had left Tangier 3 decades earlier. He had crossed the length of Africa and Asia, survived storms, courts, wars, and shipwrecks, and now carried the weight of the world's memory in his mind. The road home would take him through lands both familiar and changed. As he retraced his steps through India, Persia, and Syria, he saw empires that had risen and fallen since he'd first passed through. Old friends were gone, cities rebuilt, and even the deserts seemed different. The world had aged, and so had he. When he reached Mecca once more, he performed another pilgrimage, this time not out of duty but gratitude. For all the miles behind him, he knew how easily they could have ended in a grave. Afterward, he sailed to East Africa, visiting the Swahili coast, cities like Kilwa and Mogadishu, vibrant hubs of trade where Arab, African and Indian cultures intertwined. The rhythm of the markets, the scent of clove and ivory, the recitation of prayers at sunset, it all reminded him of how deeply connected the world had become through faith and exchange. Finally, sometime around 1354, Ibn Battuta returned to Morocco, to the same city where his story began. Tangier greeted him not with fanfare, but with the quiet familiarity of home. His parents had long since passed, his childhood friends were strangers, and his homeland felt smaller than his memories. But within him was an empire of experiences, sights and sounds from 4 continents, stories of kings and fishermen, deserts and oceans. At the request of the Sultan of Morocco, he dictated his memories to the scholar Ibn Juzai, creating the Rihla, the journey. In its pages, Ibn Battuta preserved not just his adventures, but the pulse of the 14th century world, a global network bound by trade, hospitality, and belief. His account became a bridge between civilizations, a testament that curiosity could be as holy as prayer. He had left as a pilgrim and returned as a historian of humanity. His map was not inked with borders, but with connections, proof that in an age before compasses and colonies, one man could ride across the known world guided only by faith, courage, and the irresistible pull of the horizon.